Welcome back, folks. So today we're going to get into a bit more detail in terms of how Adderall works. So we'll leave with a bit of an understanding of how this works scientifically. But before we do that, I did want to provide a more in-depth discussion of the history of amphetamines themselves and Adderall. Since we talked more in detail last time really about the history of our understanding of ADHD itself. So even though amphetamines were first synthesized in the 1800s, they were kind of lost to history for some time. But then once they were rediscovered, they were initially used as a decongestant. People quickly realized the stimulant effects of amphetamines after using them as decongestants, and it was also quickly realized that they could be addictive to a certain extent. Amphetamines became more broadly used during World War II, once the stimulant effects were understood, so they were used on purpose for their stimulant effects and as a performance enhancer for soldiers in the war. Germans used the stimulants as an alertness aid to kind of keep them awake and able to perform for longer periods of time, for example, and Japanese kamikaze airmen as kind of a stimulatory preparation before going on suicide missions. But it wasn't just the Germans and the Japanese who were using amphetamines as performance enhancers. They were widely used by U.S. soldiers as well. Very large amounts of amphetamines were purchased in 1942. As you can imagine, during World War II, most soldiers were, of course, sleep deprived, especially those who might have kind of been on the front lines experiencing bombing, for example. And amphetamines were used specifically for their stimulant effects because they kind of help overcome some of the emotional hurdles that soldiers may have been experiencing. So, for example, some of their behaviors were altered. Taking an amphetamine would kind of reduce the fear being experienced by soldiers. It would make them more confident. Soldiers would also feel less what at the time was called combat fatigue, what we now understand as PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder. And so this is a bit of an interesting kind of use case for amphetamines because they were used to kind of push soldiers beyond what they, should have been physically capable of. And in particular, we see kind of pushing soldiers past what they are emotionally capable of as well. So potentially morally questionable uses of amphetamines in these cases. Now, so that is the recent history of the use of amphetamines, and that led to the treatment of ADHD. So before we jump into the science of how amphetamines work, let's do a quick review of the symptoms of ADHD that are meant to be treated. So ADHD has 3 subtypes: inattentive, hyperactive and impulsive, or both. Here's a list of symptoms for inattention, right? So missing details, difficulty sustaining attention or organizing, and easily distractible. Hyperactivity and impulsivity, on the other hand, you have fidgeting and restlessness, can't stay seated, constantly on the go or moving, and talking nonstop, for example. So what is leading to these types of symptoms that we see for folks with ADHD? People with ADHD have misfiring or kind of incorrect or bad signaling in the brain. So let's take a moment to talk a little bit more about the brain and how those signals work so that we can understand how Adderall works. In the next video, we will talk more about how brain signaling works.